welcome to the Bald Ambition Podcast. I am your bald host, Mookie Spitz, and the one with ambition today is Mr. David Garrison. He is the founder and CEO of Connect Network. Welcome aboard, David.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm excited. This is great. I am so glad this worked out.
Yes, I think we're going to have a good conversation, and I'd like to key it up by talking about organizational development and efficiency, which has been an ongoing theme on the pod. There's been a focus on making things work better. There's been a focus on selling consultatively. There's been a focus on optimizing not only the machinations of business, but the benefit to customers and ultimately staff, employees. We've talked about migrating careers and transitions in life. And I think all of this comes to the head with what you're doing. And I would love to set it up with a couple really bad predictions, if I can. Back in 2016, 2017, prior to ChatGPT's November 2022 paradigm shift with the bots, Jeffrey Hinton, the great granddaddy of artificial intelligence, and Ezekiel Emanuel, thought leader within oncology, predicted that thanks to machine learning, radiologists would soon be out of a job. And the reason they predicted this was because the machines were doing a far better job at histology. They were doing a far better job statistically than the human experts in terms of analyzing and interpreting radiograms. Now, fast forward, there's been a slurry of articles proving them wrong. Radiology departments across the country integrating artificial intelligence have actually increased their staff significantly. And the reason that's cited is, and I think this is the segue to the great stuff that you're doing, is that when we're talking about operational efficiency, when we're talking about organizational development, the human factor is paramount, including and perhaps especially in healthcare. It's not just about doing the analytics, it's not just about getting the work done, but it's about connecting humans, building bridges, empowering folks with empathy. And I think the data is there, proving the experts wrong, that the ghost in the machine is here to stay. Given that, can you tell us a little bit about Connect Networks? Tell us about what you're doing and why you founded the company, and how all of this ties together with a much brighter and more Pollyanna future of the workplace.
That's awesome. That's a very nice segue. I quite like it. So Connect Networks is, we call it human-centered tech that brings people together for meaningful one-to-one conversations at scale and for a purpose. And I can explain how it works. At the surface level, it's super simple. On the back end, it gets a little complicated with the tech, but at the surface level, this is really a very straightforward concept that we are connecting people one by one to each other in order to get away from the kind of structural constraints of networking that lead to bad outcomes both for organizations and for the individuals themselves. And we can talk about each one of those separately or together, and we can talk about the stats and so on. But at a high level, all we're doing is saying, Spitz, you should know David, and David, you should know Spitz, and you guys will have a great conversation. And here's each of you in your best light. Go have a great talk.
And let's dive right into the tactics. Look under the hood so people know exactly what we're talking about. David, you're working at Department X in a company, and I'm Mookie working in Department Y.
Yep.
When you put the Venn diagrams of our job descriptions together, there's a little bit of overlap, and there
Yep.
probably should be more.
Yep.
How do you connect David with Mookie through your network?
Yeah. So why don't I walk through a kind of a brief history of Connect and then tell you what actually happens for the user. And then we can talk about what's going on in the back end. But so Connect started as an idea. Well, first of all, I'd done a whole set of research. I believe you got a copy of the journal that we published on the back of it, um, on how we lead through organizational empathy. So about 8 years ago, we published that, and that led to some interesting conversations. I'm co-founder of a company called Climate and Capital, which started as a media company focused on the business and finance of climate change. And Climate and Capital has done well, but the reason it comes up in this context is because we started a little experiment while we were there that became what we called Climate and Capital Connect. And the basic idea was that we wanted to just take a couple handfuls of people around the world who we knew didn't know each other and ask if we could just introduce them and just see if we could figure out kind of what made a good introduction, see if we could get better at it. And the reason was is that as a newsroom, you or I, Spitz, we make a introduction once, twice, three times, and it's fine. You write a nice note, you say you guys should really know each other, and then you hope something good comes of it. But when your team's doing that kind of 10 times a week, you start to realize that the process of networking sucks. It's a black box. It's awkward. Nobody likes it. It requires you to be, consistent and, strategic every time you're writing one of those notes. You don't know what happens. Like, it's not great. And add to that some people don't like doing it anyway. They don't like that kind of outreach and proactive extroversion, and you've got a recipe for bad. And so
Now you're referring to internal networking within an organization. Is that correct?
Well, so yeah, so this is an important distinction. So where we started off this experiment is with an external network, right? So this is a set of professionals in climate and sustainability who didn't know each other and wouldn't know each other normally. And we just asked for their permission to introduce them to each other for a good conversation. We said, we will tell you, Spitz, that you will have a great conversation with Jane in Australia, and we'll tell you, maybe why. But really, it's up to you guys to figure out what good conversation you want to have. In fact, we've done some early experiments with trying to actually kind of force you guys into specific conversations. It didn't go so well. So, this started because we wanted to just solve that newsroom problem and see if we could get better at introductions. It turns out that that experiment was not the most interesting thing about Climate and Capital Connect. The most interesting thing turned out to be that people liked the conversations and it challenged how they were thinking about what the work they were doing. So you, Spitz, you're used to talking to other leaders in a space. Engineers are really used to talking to engineers. Lawyers are really used to talking to lawyers. Doctors are really used to talking to doctors. But when you challenge them to articulate the work they're doing or their insights to a new kind of person on a regular basis, there's a whole set of really fascinating skills that develop and dynamics in the conversations that you can create. That network became too big for us to do manually after a little while. And so we spun it off into a separate venture. I left to go build the automated product. That took, I don't know, 8, 9 months. And then we started charging for it. And we've just been running that ever since. And so we've been running that platform, that alpha platform built with duct tape and string for 2.5 years. And we've got those insights. And now what we're doing is saying, okay, based on all of those conversations, those thousands of conversations that we've set up, what kinds of lessons and strategies can we take and apply to different types of social and business problems? This then leads me to your point, which is that you can take that process, that platform, those insights, and the dynamic of one-to-one conversations, not in the kind of scale of 10 people that you or I can introduce each other in a week, but like the scale of hundreds of thousands of people at once. Take that and apply it to all sorts of fascinating use cases. That's where
So
we're at.
Awesome. So, just to summarize for our listeners, from pretty much a PR, public relations lens,
Yeah,
you are facilitating and encouraging networking outside of an organization, and you are seeking ways to automate it, optimize it, that it's clunky to introduce yourself to others. Networking, as we all know, is a big pain. We generally hate our LinkedIn experiences because they're tedious and they're mechanical. And you introduce technology to this clunky enterprise, which is nonetheless so necessary. And then you came to the realization that these same tools are even better served when the vector is turned inward to an internal networking opportunity where communication and connection and the building of empathy is just so important
right.
organizationally for individuals to flourish and for their companies to ultimately benefit. Is that right?
That's right. So there's one minor thing that I would add to that, and that is that I don't think this is an either or. And in fact, some of the most fascinating use cases are in the blurring of the lines around stakeholder groups. So and how you I suppose there's maybe a second thing too, which is that it is not so much that we're really focused on the tech. It is almost the opposite. I sometimes talk about this idea of design minimalism, kind of humanistic minimalism in the design aesthetic we're going for the user experience. I want to focus all of the attention on the human interaction, on real two people talking to each other, just like you and I are doing. We all know how to do that. We all like it when we have a great conversation with someone we think is interesting. We just don't do it very often, and it's hard to set up. And so, really, what we're doing is getting away from the idea that tech innovation is the goal, right? This cool, new, flashy thing that we can do, there are incredible things that we can do on the back end. But from your point of view, all you want is the conversation. And so, that's really what we want to hold at center is this idea of the human interaction. So, those two pieces one, that it is human versus tech, and two that it is and I know you've talked about that with other guests, and two that it's this idea of finding creative ways to take those one-to-one interactions between two people and use them for business or social outcomes.
Yeah, and that's why I think my setup with the bad radiology predictions from two noteworthy experts, both in tech and oncology, resonate for those two very reasons, which
Yeah.
is focusing exclusively on the technology begs the question of the human component.
Yep.
And when the technology opens up individuals to better connect and relate to each other, that explodes and
Totally.
flourishes in its own way to ostensibly the ultimate goal of the whole enterprise.
Right.
In healthcare, it's to improve public health,
Yep.
quality of life, extend life.
Yep.
And in an organizational corporate setting, it's to bolster these connections and enhance teamwork and collaboration and the overall culture of an organization. Is that right?
Right. So let me kind of maybe it'll help to give an example, right?
Yeah.
And I was just reading Edelman's Health Trust report that it's put out recently,
Yeah,
and
I have deja vu with Edelman. So some might say PTSD, but you and I were both at Edelman
yep,
for quite some time. I was head of digital health
yep, and
at the
I
New
was
York office for a while.
and you were nice enough to talk to me as part of the consultant strategy consulting group. Um,
That's right. That's right because they were trying to your exact point better integrate otherwise heavily siloed specialists. Noteworthy for having separate P&Ls throughout the organization.
right,
Edelman is just noteworthy for being siloed in the sense of
right,
ostensibly bolstering competition and boosting profits, but integration was a little bit more challenging because of exactly that.
yeah.
So
So
so so our background and the way we got to know each other as collaborators within a dynamic
is a
professional
great
setting
example.
actually sets the stage for the pain points
exactly.
that your network is solving.
Yeah, so let's come back to the pain points because I want to give you this kind of health example just because I know your listeners like health a lot. So,
Yeah,
I think
some of
normally
them
when
do,
we,
not all of them. We've had.
but so Edelman, when it does its health report, and Edelman has invested a lot in its trust work since you and I were there, and
Oh, absolutely.
I really respect where it's gotten to. Anyway, a bunch of things stood out to me about this one, but one in particular is that often when we're talking about trust, we are talking about uh, how we distribute ideas and messages from one stakeholder group to another, right? So, in the case of health, that's usually going from the doctor to the patient, right? That's the direction you want it to go to, right? And so you're trying to deliver the messages. There are other ones too. You could be talking about researchers to legislators. There are other ones as well. But really, like the big one is doctors or that healthcare institution to the patient, right? I think that's fine, and I totally appreciate why Edelman does that. I think it's good work, and there's good impact to be had. Then we certainly could get better at doing that. That relationship of connecting physicians to patients is one we spend so much time on, but we miss two others in the process. One is the value of kind of practitioner to practitioner relationships and how they influence how we practice and the types of insights we actually bring to patient work. The types of innovation, the types of collaboration change when you change who a physician talks to. Often what happens is that we're really excited about the last three people we talked to. And so what if you only talk to other radiologists, you're only going to get radiological ideas, right? It's when you push someone outside their comfort zone in manageable, not overwhelming ways that good things happen. So the one example is to say, like, if you can push yourself into thinking about these stakeholder relationships as within groups, then good things happen. The second one that's kind of interesting is that Connect actually has potential to help with in healthcare is to say, what about patients to patients? So, always before, as an example, we've been able to say to a patient, there's lots of medical resources for you. You get diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. Oh my God, we've got lots of pamphlets and we've got lots of information and support groups for you to go to, right? And like, here's the 5 things you should do from a medical point of view. And your physician will tell you that. And that's a great set of messages. But what if we could say to the patient, at the same time, like an insurance company, an insurance brand could say, we know the other 20,000 people who've been diagnosed in the Northeast with the same condition in the last 3 months. So they're roughly at the same point in the patient journey that you are. What if we could say to them, hey, why don't we as the insurance company connect you to one of those other patients and you guys just have a conversation about how you are finding the actual diagnosis and the living with it? See if that impacts patient outcomes. And I think what you'd find is that the dynamic of those conversations was wildly different than the conversation between the physician and the patient. And if you can do that at scale and actually understand the things that are coming out of those conversations in measurable ways, that's the promise of Connect Networks.
Yeah, that's huge. And it again reiterates this theme of using artificial intelligence as the beginning of the connection point. The real goal is bringing humans together. And in your model here, if a managed care company can actually connect patients to each other peer
Yep.
to peer based on their moment in their journey,
Yep.
then that could be amazing. Now, there are provisos here,
Of
namely
course.
the regulatory environment, personal,
Totally.
private health information. I just had Dale
Totally.
Cook of Philly Cook Consulting on, my
Yep.
last illustrious guest. And we talked about some of the chaos in the FDA currently and his
Totally.
frustration that there isn't a clear mandate moving forward.
Yeah.
But all that said, everything is evolving inclusive of the regulatory environment, which might be a little bit chaotic now. But
Right.
it's good to think with the end in mind. What does awesome look like?
Right.
When we have the data, we could correlate that data with the ultimate goal of connecting people better.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think, the interesting thing here is that when you hold human interaction at the center of this, normally when we innovate in technology, we get so excited about the tech innovation. We're like, oh my God, we can do incredible things. We should totally do those things, right? And I think what I'm really trying to do here is hold humans at center and say, how do in the middle of this, how does the tech fall away? So, for example, on our platform, I mentioned this kind of broader platform design strategy of human-centered minimalism. There are two important pieces of that, to my mind. One is that the human experience of connecting should stand at the center. That the person should walk away remembering that human interaction, not the things it took to get there. The second thing is that the platform should be as invisible as possible to users. And it shouldn't, for example, require learning an entire new language or set of behaviors to use effectively, like likes. And, if you think about how we had to learn, you kind of learn into this whole set of social behaviors, this doesn't require that. This is stuff we know how to do. We know how to talk to someone. And so this idea that you need a heavy platform, I just don't buy it. And so when you think about where we're heading with this, with what we're doing with Connect, our members interact with our platform less than half a minute every 2 weeks, and yet they like it. Our engagement rates are awesome. We get, between 25 and 35% participation from members every match round. That's not clicking a like or sharing it. That's spending half an hour with someone they don't know beforehand. And
That's terrific. So, back in the day it was C prompt backslash.
right,
And then the CRT, the green glowing monitor, would be looking at you, and then it was all up to you.
right,
Maybe you could type dir and get a listing of files that were on your floppy disk.
yep,
Or maybe you could type run and it
yep.
would run something that was in memory, and it could only hold one thing at a time in its
That sounds an
in
awful
its
lot like me, actually.
64K memory, which is about where my brain still is at, to your point.
Totally.
But I think you're absolutely right. If the problem is map and territory, is interface and experience, and if you can make the human interaction as transparent, immediate, real time, and effortless as possible,
Right,
then you're ensured engagement. Because the number one obstacle to the use of technology is simple inconvenience. If it's a pain in the ass, people aren't going to do it. And if it integrates into their lives as seamlessly as possible,
right,
then people are going to give it a whirl.
right.
And if you try it, you might like it.
There's another advantage that might be kind of relevant for what we're talking about around AI, and predictions that are wrong. um, and that's that, normally when we're talking about tech and using the tech to introduce people, what we want to do is make sure that the tech is right. That's the conversation. How do we get as close as possible to a correct answer with using the tech? And so in our case, what that would look like is saying, we knew why you and Jane should talk, right? And so we introduced you and we told you that, and we told you what you should talk about, right? That would be the kind of logical progression of a normal tech platform development strategy, right? And all of your metrics then would revolve around how close your AI got to being right, and whether the process ended up with the conversation being what you expected it to be, right? Ours is actually not just kind of acknowledging serendipity, but is leaning into it, right? And so when we ran early experiments in actually giving people prompts about what to talk about, Spitz, we're going to introduce you to Jane, and here's what Jane's working on, and that's the only thing you should talk to her about. It didn't go well. People didn't like it. The conversations weren't as good.
What's the difference or the relationship between the organizational level of this experience and optimization and then the individual's participation and goals?
Well, so, I think it's a good question because, normally when we're looking at pain points, you're thinking about what the organization's pain points are. We're all leading companies or nonprofits or governments or whatever it is. And so you're thinking about how an organization, what it needs to achieve, right? So even from a comms perspective, you get a physician in a room and you get your team of physicians talking to patients, and you're like, here's what our hospital is trying to do, right? You go and you talk to those patients and you tell them X and you get them to do Y, and here's the outcomes we're expecting, right? That is the normal process for this. Nowhere in that conversation did the patient's pain points get mentioned, right? And so, what I think is probably useful is to break apart what the pain points are for networks, for organizations, and what they are for individuals. So let's kind of take those one by one, and jump in here if you have other thoughts too, because I know you live in this world as well. I see a set of maybe four big pain points for organizations around what we're doing. One is the structural inefficiencies in information sharing, right? And we can come up with a million iterations of this, but the basic idea is that the network and information doesn't flow very well across that network. It goes through nodes, people who are connected to each other. And often what happens is that you have specific people who are bottlenecks. And even if it's well distributed, there's pockets of the network that don't talk to each other. And to your point, it's siloed and, all these awesome things, right?
Yeah,
So
number one, fragmentation,
totally.
system wide, right?
Right. And so, and this is the classic example that I was giving of like lawyers talk to lawyers and, physicians talk to physicians and never the two shall meet, and that sucks from an organizational perspective because it leads to, two basic problems. One is really transactional thinking that leads to narrow outcomes, right? So if I only talk to physicians because I know that I own, this is what I need, I'm never going to get challenged on what I need, right? And so you're always talking and you get really good at finding people to talk to who look and feel like people you've already talked to. And
Yeah, it's
from
tribal. So it's fragmented and it's tribal.
Totally. And so that's the muscle you build as an organization. And so that's problem one with this idea of like the inefficiency of information sharing. The second is that there are limitations in terms of the types of innovation and collaboration that result from it, for all those same reasons that we talked about before. That's problem number one for an organization. That's a real pain point. I think, frankly, what's kind of cool about all of this is about this set of pain points that I'm going to give you is that some of them are super obvious. They're things we've talked about, ad nauseum in business world. But some of them start to be things that actually are real opportunities because they're greenfield. We've never actually talked about them. So talent is kind of somewhere in between. What we're seeing is that there's this rare networking skill that gets developed over time through matches in identifying opportunity through curiosity. You know, there are the obvious things of like, hey, look, we can improve how we rehire. I think there's a stat that 8% of hires in large corporations are boomerang hires, and they're 40% more likely to be with the firm 4 years after that than people who are first time hires. That's a pretty good bottom line impact if you're thinking about the best way to tap into an alumni network to bring in boomerang hires. From a talent point of view, that's an argument straight away for this kind of platform. But the idea of building talent development by thinking about this rare networking skill of curiosity and the kinds of questions and probing and thinking about people who don't have the same transactional needs as you, if you get really good at that, you will build an organization over time that is capable of identifying opportunities, and that's where innovation happens, right? So this is kind of the interesting place for the kind of like, hey, what we would normally think of as a pain point actually has this new version of it that this idea that focusing on human interaction enables.
Yeah, it's you're kind of flipping from pain to benefit.
Totally.
So you've got the situational setup, you've got the pain, you've got the fragmentation, the implications of tribalism, and then on the flip side, you have by facilitating and encouraging this connectivity, you break down those silos, and then you encourage renewed levels of creativity that you never thought possible, you might never have even thought about.
Totally. So like there's
Yeah.
let me give you a stat. So I don't know that I actually have the stat on here, but there was a report by Work Institute last year that, and I'll read you the quote because I pulled it before this because I thought it was interesting and we might get to this. So it says, if companies believe raising pay will retain employees, not only will they waste money on higher human capital costs, but they'll likely also not see an improvement in retention. The point that, and the very first thing, so these guys did a whole bunch of research to back that up, and the very first thing they say as the thing you need to do as a result is generating the voice of the employee and understanding perceptions of employee that cause them to quit or be at risk of leaving is the thing, right? How do you do that? And how do you do that at scale and on an ongoing basis without breaking the bank? That's a place where this kind of, if you can start to measure and pull out insights from hundreds of conversations every 2 weeks, you get a really good reporting mechanism for
Right.
that.
Right. So money is not just it's not the sole metric of success. It's not the sole metric of retention. You're talking about the human experience. And by holistically improving that experience, by empowering people with connection,
Yep.
you're creating a better work environment.
Right.
This is not organizational development calculus.
Right.
It's remedial and basic, and probably for those very reasons the most overlooked.
Right. So okay, so pain point three is one that I think we're starting to get now into pain points that an organization didn't even know it had, right? Because it doesn't frame it this way. So pain point three is business development, right? You don't normally think of this as a pain point because you are hitting your sales targets, right? And so you're not seeing the opportunity that you're not chasing. And so, normally when we think about business development, the effort you're making is all about your sales force, who they're selling to, how efficient they are, how effective they are. But what if your network of stakeholders was actually working for you and connecting to each other more frequently in a way that was more aligned to your messaging and your business outcomes that you're trying to target, with you at the center of that connection? People tend to be, like we said before, people tend to be excited about recent conversations. And so, there's a stat that says from an organization called People Path that says, between 3 and 25% of top line revenue is attributable to alumni assisted sales. You have this network, take our old firm, Edelman, 50,000 alumni that it has in the world. It has never really reached out to them, right? And never really thought about how they're connected to each other. But if those conversations ended up with some of them calling Edelman and saying like, "Hey, we've got this idea and we want to bring this client to you because we can't serve it," and you put us together and to do this,
Yeah, not non-competes aside.
totally, absolutely. But you can set up the network that way, and these conversations can be framed that way. So if you increase that revenue number by 1%, you're golden, right? That is
Yeah.
not a Salesforce activity. That is actually creating an entirely new sales channel. That's cool, right? So that's a pain point they didn't know they had. The fourth and last one is again one that most organizations wouldn't call a pain point, but we've actually seen it in some of the conversations we've had already with nonprofits in particular, which is that delivering on your brand or mission statement is actually pretty hard in some cases. And a lot of brands have connection at the core of what they're trying to do. And so, I had a conversation just yesterday with an organization that is explicitly about connecting people around the world. And yet, how are they doing it? Most of the time it's through these kind of tentpole events that they bring people together for. Everybody gets, 40 connections at this conference. They're like, oh my God, I'm so inspired. And they go away with 40 people to talk to in the next 2 weeks. And 2 months later, you're like, how many of those people did I actually call? Maybe two. and then you got to wait for the next tentpole event to get excited again. That is not a good strategic way to push out your delivery of your mission. Instead, what we do is in between those tentpole events, we don't replace them, but in between them, we do this drip, drip, drip approach of connecting people.
Externally now you're talking about? So you're flipping the
It
vector
it could be
externally.
either. Yeah. So why don't
Okay.
I? So we still haven't actually said what we do. So let me do that.
All right, all right. Can I intercede with one great case study of my own
Yeah.
that reinforces absolutely what you're talking about, and I think might contextualize your solution.
Yeah.
So I was consulting for a large healthcare data company. Now, a challenge that they had internally was contracting and its relationship to their internal sales force and their legal department and their tech
Yep.
bros.
Yep.
So, in a classic sense, they were a fragmented tribal organization
Yep.
where people of the same expertise were talking to the people of the same expertise.
Yep.
And I'd love to just share it from the lens of what exactly you're saying business development. So, this major data focused healthcare company was evolving. They were evolving in terms of offering increasingly sophisticated reports
Yep.
and AI focused kind of goodies,
Yep.
but they were being shot in the foot by their own fragmentation and tribalism.
Hmm.
So, what we were trying to do was to do what your network seems to do, which is come on, people, you just need to keep talking to each other. So we could advocate a content management system which would be optimized for traffic vis-a-vis your contracts.
Yep.
So contracts were holding up what they were trying to do because contracts could take months
Yep.
to formulate between client and customer.
Totally.
And there were log jams.
Yep.
So imagine if the lawyers could talk directly to the salespeople who could talk directly to the tech people putting together the capabilities.
Absolutely.
So this is phenomenal, not only in terms of, and I think this is important for our listeners to get across, this isn't just a buddy-buddy network
Right.
where, hey, what did you do this
Right.
week? Nice to meet you. I saw you at the water cooler.
Right.
But this is an optimized way of connecting otherwise disparate functions
Right.
in a way that could really, really benefit the overall value proposition and benefits of the organization at large.
Right. And one of the interesting things we see, so yes, to build on your point with that example, right? One of the really interesting things we see is that, there's the transactional benefit, right? This week I am working on X problem. I would really like someone to talk to who could help me think through that.
Right, it
Or who
makes
could
me
challenge.
makes me feel good. I'm a
Totally.
contract attorney, and it would make me feel good to see how the techie bro had a hard afternoon. Right,
Or on a transactional basis
right,
is to say like, hey, I'm really struggling with this transaction that I'm working on as a lawyer. It has to do with emerging regulatory constraints in Germany, right? I'd love to just talk to someone who could challenge me on it. And then you put someone in touch with put them in touch with someone in Japan who may not be in Germany, but they're 2 steps ahead of Germany, and so they can say, here's the mistakes we made in Japan, right? I actually worked on a project for this exactly like this, I don't know, 20 years ago now, for a friendly neighborhood global pharmaceutical company, where we, my role was simply every 2 weeks to get this group of leaders from across markets to talk to each other about what the problems that were emerging in their regulatory space was. It was just this call and recapping it, and that was the project, right? Like what we're doing here on a transactional level is to get that done. What I would say is there's also though the non-transactional benefit. And that actually turns out to be huge for organizations because what you want to have happen is that yeah, maybe Jane knows who to call when she has this problem today. She gets connected with them to solve. But what you really want is for Jane to be so connected in her company that when she has a problem in a conference room, she can just say, I know who to call. I'm going to call Spitz. Right. And and that, you may have had a conversation 4 months ago that really didn't have a transactional purpose, but she knows what you do, she knows how you think, and she knows how she can work with you. You do that
Yeah.
over and over again in the scale of thousands at a time, and you have a very resilient, very robust flow of information across your company's network.
Can I raise one little yellow flag
Yeah,
as a potential objection before we roll into specific capabilities? And this is part of the rationale for siloing in an organization, which is the inherently hierarchical, control based structure of most organizations.
yeah,
If I would lead a department and my minions would be set loose, having all of these sidebar conversations and creating relationships outside of a formal organizational structure,
yeah,
then that introduces a level of chaos in one sense and certainly a lack of control in the other. So, how do you assuage the potential concerns of senior management, even mid tier leadership,
yeah.
in a sense that their employees aren't running amok, creating ostensibly new processes, new methodologies, new relationships that could be seen as even violative?
Yep, yep. So I think there's two responses to that. And look, I think it's a valid concern. Look, if you're a command and control type of organization, this,
Most are, frankly, we've worked in many organizations at various levels, and I think it's fair to say that they all are. And that's why I bring this up. I'm
yeah,
just
no, no,
I'm putting a little salt in the wound of the
yeah,
inevitability of hierarchy, control, and politics.
totally.
Just being realistic.
No, so that's why I'm saying, like, I think it's a valid
Yeah.
concern. And so,
Right.
if we were pitching right now and you brought that up, I'd say it's totally
Yeah.
real. Let's talk about kind of
Right.
what constraints we put on this, how we frame it for people. You know,
Right.
there are, we've got, part of the idea behind Connect, is this idea that some portion of these are going to be you can analyze them through large language models, right? So let's just take a number of let's just do a stat, right? Let's say you're an organization with 5,000 employees and you get just a 10% participation rate in the whole program. That's not like the number of people that match overall. That's just like 10% of your people say they want to participate in this.
Yeah, they just plug into your system.
Totally.
Right. Right.
That's 250 conversations every match round. Let's say 50% of those give permission to analyze the conversation. Imagine being able to have a stream of 125 conversations that you can see emerging patterns from on a regular basis to understand your people and the things they're struggling with in order to enact the command and control commands that you're giving them. That is super valuable information, right? That's enormous to be able to have that every 2 weeks, a report that comes out and says, like, here's what we're seeing as emerging patterns and what people are struggling with. Maybe you can address that with the team, right?
Yeah, that's
All
a great insight, which
right.
is, you could data mine some of this. You could do it in
Totally.
aggregate. You can assure
Totally.
people with an anonymized
That's one
kind
of the
of
values of
backing.
us, right?
And then as a manager, I would love to be privy, even in a statistical kind of manner, to the zeitgeist of what's going on with my team and any potential pain points or opportunities that could bubble up through an analysis, a GPT analysis, even of the conversation.
Right. So that's the kind of easy answer to assuage concerns
Yeah,
because
and again, I don't mean to torpedo your value prop.
no,
I'm just bringing up thoughts that might be top of mind even to our listeners, which is you are bringing transparency and connectivity to an organization.
yeah,
And there are obvious roadblocks to that, not all of which are simply technical or logistical. There's
totally.
a lot of emotion that goes beyond this. And this demands a paradigm shift on the part of senior leadership, not only to embrace this kind of technology and opportunity, but to adopt it within a way that's transformative in how they manage and how they run an organization.
So that's the easy answer, right? Like if you were in the room, that would be the thing that I would know would kind of make you feel good about your command and control structure, right?
Yeah.
But I think there's actually a counter. And and that's a little bit harder to pitch, but we mentioned the empathy research I did 8 years ago. One of the findings from it, and one of the kind of the big takeaway from the whole thing was that you can't, just like innovation, you can't control empathy, right? You can't go to a team and say, "Hey, we need to increase revenue. Go innovate," right? Like,
Yeah.
we're
Nobody likes being told what to do.
well, but even if you've built that culture, like
Right.
you tell someone go innovate, what are they going to do? Like it's not practical. And the
They
same
they
is
might they might start a podcast.
yeah, they might, but 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 I think it's not a guided. There's that old saw about ad agencies about like how you get the best work out of creatives is that you give them a whole bunch of constraints and tell them to be creative within it, right? And so the similar type of thing happens with empathy and innovation. Because you can't control it, your job as a leader isn't to force it and not to, your job as a leader is to create an environment in which empathy and innovation are more likely to happen more frequently for a purpose. And that's really the thing that this kind of stuff does is you're taking small steps and allowing people to experiment with minimal risk. You're taking a prototyping approach to empathy and progressively layering larger and larger initiatives over this really kind of like stepwise experimentation at an individual level, just at scale, right? And so, this comes, there's a great line from a woman named Belinda Palmer who published back in, I don't know, 10 years ago now, something where in Harvard Business Review, where she says like, she quoted a CEO she was talking to. She's an expert in empathy and empathy research. And the quote was that from the CEO was that we all know it's important to be empathetic, but how do I galvanize 48,000 people in my workforce, most of whom think that empathy is for wimps, right? That's still largely true for a lot of organizations and society. So, the real question is how do we set this up so that you're constantly refreshing your views and you're forcing yourself just through practice to meet people who challenge how you're articulating the work that you do. That's the exercise, and that's a muscle that you can build.
And you know what I'm hearing in addition to empathy, which to your point might be a little bit problematic from
Sure.
a mansplaining whiplash point of view, right? I'm not. I don't want to be empathetic. I want to be tough. I want to be a leader. I want to get the job done, which
Right.
is understandable, especially these days.
Yep.
The converse of that is the Ray Dalio style of radical candor,
Yep.
and I could see a lot of that coming out of your value prop as well, which is if you enhance transparency and communication between peers, they're sharing their feelings about what's going on and each other.
Yeah.
And that has an expression of revelation, of honesty
Yep.
and directness in ways that were otherwise cloaked in silence and presumption.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah.
I talk about a lot internally about building a culture in these networks of curious generosity, right? And and that's an interesting one. When I talk about it, it's important to state that it's not just curiosity and it's not just generosity on their own. They're both good things. But when you combine them practically, when you have like practical ways that you can change a conversation in order to get people to be more curious, to exhibit more curious generosity, good things happen. And that means that when you are being curious, you're not just like probing in order to get something out of it. You're probing in order to improve what the other person is doing. And there's a bunch of non-altruistic reasons for doing that, right? Goal setting, like by doing that, you make the person value you, right? That is, from an organizational perspective, a good thing. The second point is that when you are being generous, you're not just being randomly generous, you're being generous for a point that you are being curious about, right? You are understanding more so that it's not kind of blanket offers. It's just like getting down layers and layers and layers into insight. And that combination of curiosity and generosity is really powerful when you start to do it. And interestingly, what we're starting to see, it's all qualitative right now, but 2.5 years in, what we're starting to see with people who've done, now upwards of 60 matches, um, is that people, the language they use to describe what they're looking for in connections is actually different after they've done 20 matches, say, than when they first join.
That's good. Yeah.
That's cool, right? And so that's the response I would make to that person is like, I totally get it. You want to drive results. Let's just say that, from we've built this model for clients, but for a firm of 2,500 employees, there's an estimated 1.1 million to 3.2 million in value, with some use cases for this getting up to 6.4 million. At the low end, that's a 3x ROI, right? And for nonprofits, like for a 5,000 member network, it can actually generate a net of $25,000 per month for the nonprofit. That's enough to pay someone to actually hire someone to engage strategically around engaging stakeholders.
All right,
That's
that's great. So
huge.
now that we're talking ROI in quantified terms, let's get into the lexicon.
Yes.
Wait, you're using terms like a match.
Yes.
You're using terms like, touch points across the organization as their own metric.
Yep.
And there's ambiguity about this to this point.
Sure.
So can you add specificity to what exactly goes on? Let's cite a use case.
Yep.
I'm Spitz in Department X, and you are David in Department Y.
Yep.
I plug in Connected Network, or my boss does, and then all of a sudden I get an email saying that this guy David has set up something cool.
Yeah. So
What goes on?
yeah.
What's the actual experience like for organizational leaders who implement it
Yep.
and for the staff who actually use it?
Yeah, so right now what we're doing is pulling together this cohort of kind of bold client leaders who are interested in really pushing how they challenge each other to see the potential of human networks. So the basic process is pretty straightforward. Like I said at the beginning of this, like from a user's point of view, this is pretty simple. You become a member, right? And for organizations, what we require is that they're actually coming in with an existing network of stakeholders. They don't have to have done anything with it, right? So this could be something totally new for the greenfield for them, right? To the point about like take Edelman, which has never really pushed on its alumni network. Those 50,000 people, like you could come and say, we have these 50,000 people, we have their emails, but we really haven't done anything, right?
Okay, so let's time out for a second. So the organizations and you start with a goal.
Correct. So we set
Okay, so step one, let's go step by step,
Yep.
because I want listeners to know how it works and also get the opportunity to partner with you to make it work.
Sure.
So step one is you do some discovery
Yep.
with a potential client, with an organization who's willing to do this kind of beta test, if you will, and hey, what's going on? And then out of your conversations, for example, in this use case, we have a vast alumni network,
Sure.
and we could tap into it. We tap into it a little bit, but it's entirely ad hoc. We've got no systems in place for doing it. Dave, can you help us out?
Right. So, and that use case could be any number of use cases, right?
Right,
So,
right,
and we can go through some of those. But what we do first is we go in and we talk about, okay, what are you actually trying to achieve with this alumni network? Is it that you want them simply to know each other? Like you talk to an alumni network for a school, and what they're really looking for is advancement donations. You talk to an alumni network for a corporation, and what they might talk about more is the boomerang hiring. They might talk more about the business development and increasing sales by X and being able to
right.
attribute that by Y to Y, right? Like those conversations, that's the first conversation. What are you trying to actually achieve? What can we tie networked activity to in terms of business or social outcomes? I mean, at a really practical level, like how are we going to measure the success? From there, you're going to
So
want,
we've got goal and we got KPI
right.
to put
And
it in the nomenclature. Key
perfect.
performance indicator. We got this huge this network, and we can squeeze them, we can connect them, and
Yeah,
then out will pop a
something amazing.
better recruitment.
Right.
So it's an HR benefit and potential business opportunities throughout their own networks for increased revenue.
Totally.
Okay,
So,
great, great.
so from there, the next step is to say, okay, there's a bunch of, let's talk about how we actually want to, the dynamic of these conversations and matches to happen, right? So, one organization we've been talking to is this, Global Professional Association. And they're particularly interested in emphasizing collaboration, in increasing collaboration between different generations of workers. So they don't want mentorship, they want collaboration. And so finding ways, so the kinds of criteria that we would use to match people in that organization is very different from the kinds of criteria we would use at an organization that was really, like a law firm trying to connect people across geographies, right? So they've got two practices, one in London, one in New York, that are, just don't talk to each other, right? And so the criteria for making the connections is different for those two organizations. And that's the next step, is talking through what they want to prioritize, right?
Great. So kind of like you're putting together an algorithm of connectivity in a sense.
Absolutely. I mean, that
Okay.
is a good way to describe it. And
Yeah.
and the wonderful thing about what we're doing is that you can actually experiment with the algorithms, right? So you can say, hey, what happens if we made this 12% instead of 11% of the criteria? How do we want to, is that an experiment that's worth running? I don't know. But you could do that. And so what we then do is we say, okay, how do we now roll this out? What are the ways that this gets the most traction with the groups that you care about, right? That is a comms exercise. But it is an important one because most of the time new technology implementations fail not because the technology is not awesome, but because it just gets, shunned by the body. And so that's really the next step. And then we launch. And what
Okay, hold on. Time out. That's a
Okay,
big step.
that was
So it sounds to me like you get senior executive leadership managerial buy-in to engender the behavioral change necessary to implement whatever it is you're trying to implement. Is that correct?
yeah. And what we've talked about with some of the organizations is wanting to do a pilot so that they can actually build momentum before they launch it and have people excited and buzzing about it at the water cooler. Like all those good things are part of.
So internal messaging, internal positive reinforcement for giving this a whirl, assurance about privacy,
Yep,
establishment of trust
yep,
in this experience with an implicit or explicit benefit to the employee who participates somehow wrapped in that, which is why should I bother?
totally.
Well, you should bother for ABC reasons, which will do XYZ for you.
Right. Exactly.
Right.
And,
Okay.
and by the way, we have not gotten to the individual pain points, right? Which is where so we can come back to those because I think that's actually a super important set of discussions to have around why your employees give a damn, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah, yeah. Let's table that for now because we are on this very tactical, very specific
okay,
trajectory of implementing your goodies.
okay.
So,
So
so,
that's
so just to summarize for our listeners, you do discovery in terms of goal setting and the establishment of key performance indicators to reveal the success or failure of said goals.
yeah,
That's step one. Step two is you get buy-in from everyone to implement this, including the end user.
yeah.
And then step three,
Well, actually, so there's a kind of, I don't know, 1B-ish,
yeah,
which is that part of the value of having these networks and working with us is that you get to talk to other people who are trying to be creative about how they're using human interaction in their businesses, right? So, often as you can see from all the examples we're giving, like there's the obvious stuff that you probably come in knowing you want to do with it, right? But there's all these other spin-off benefits that you probably just didn't even know to think about. And when you have the law firm who's approaching it this way, in the same group as the alumni association for the Ivy League school, talking to each other and being like, I didn't even think about using my alumni for the law firm to drive business. Like that's part of that collaboration and learning from each other, not from
Right.
us, but
So in
from
a
each other.
sense, we go from after you implement, which is I guess 3, you draw an arrow back to your goals and KPIs, which could actually be evolving
Totally.
dynamically.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So anyway,
Right.
but yes,
Okay.
then we get to the launch. And interestingly, at this by this point, we haven't actually touched any of the users, right? So all of this is kind of behind the scenes.
Sure, it's a setup for
Totally.
what's ostensibly a prototype here, or a beta test, or give it a whirl, see
Right.
how, throw it against the wall, see what happens at
Right.
this organization.
Right. But I the thing that's really important to in the reason I'm making that point is because again, I go back to this idea of like my design strategy for the platform is really focused on this idea of human-centered minimalism, right? So from the user's perspective, like they don't really care about any of that. Like they what they want is a great conversation that helps them do what they need to do better and feel good about it, right? Like
Absolutely. So we're changing perspective here.
totally.
So the goals shift. You've got the macro goals of the organization
Right.
tied into the KPIs, but you've got the micro goals of the end user, which are not so much tied to organizational KPIs, and in fact, not really at all. But how do I make this project I'm working on smoother? How do I get a little bit more quality time with my kids at soccer practice? How do I solve this problem with expertise that my tribe doesn't have by reaching outside of my silo to see if I can actually talk to somebody who knows what they're talking about?
Right. And I think that last one is super important and one we don't spend enough time on in business. And that is, what if I'm scared of something, right? And how do I get past that fear? One way to do that, one piece of that answer is often just talking to someone who is willing to give you some challenge to you in a generous way, right? That is
Yeah.
huge. And the fact that with our system you don't have to work for that, that it actually does the hard grunt work of setting up these meetings for you is awesome, right? You just show up and the system puts you in your best light. It says, Spitz is incredible. He has an energy about him that is contagious. He knows his stuff on digital strategy, and he has this depth of experience with client work in comms at large and small agencies that you really want to know about. Like that changes how Jane comes to this conversation for
Woohoo! And don't ask them to proof your code.
you.
So everyone's got their strengths and weaknesses, right? Which
Totally.
is part of the charm of your networking,
Right.
which is I'm good at this. I'm really good at this. But you know what? Bright lights cast long shadows, and in those shadows, I'm reaching out to you because your light shines way brighter in areas where I could use your expertise.
Right. Again, I go back to the same point, which is there is a transactional value and to the business, right? Good things will happen when you have these non-transactional conversations, but it is also huge to have people feel more heard, seen, understood, right? And there's some incredible stats around that. So, like, the cost of mental health related absenteeism for US employers alone is 17 billion. That's from the American Institute of Stress.
That's probably low, actually. That's a low estimate.
Fine.
My guess, even though it's in their best interest to prop it up, but just this idea of misalignment is paramount, right? People feel stress when they don't know what to do. To your point, they're afraid and they're in the dark. I think more so than anything else, you are lifting the veil of people's hopes, their aspirations, their needs, their day-to-day uncertainties, and you're creating an inclusive, friendly, empathetic environment where people can share and grow together. What is not to like?
Right. Okay. So now we're at the point that you've launched, right? And good things are happening, and like everybody's excited. What does it actually look like as a process, right, from the user? Okay. So this is where it gets super simple and it's awesome, right? So every 2 weeks, Spitz gets an email from the system. That's the cadence we've landed on for climate and capital. We found that more than that, and it was overwhelming. People just couldn't keep up with it, and people participated at lower rates. Less than that, and people just kind of weren't remembering who we were. So 2 weeks is our cadence. But every 2 weeks, you get an email from the system that says, "Hey, Spitz, do you want to participate in what we call a match round?" That is really the only lingo you need to know. Do you want to be connected with someone? You don't have to say yes. This system is built for busy people schedules. And so there are some people who match, I don't know, twice a year. They meet a couple new people that are interesting. They have a fun conversation for half an hour. They're good. Other people match literally every round. And so, 2.5 years in, every 2 weeks, we've now got people who are up over 60 matches. Like,
How do you market condition Spitz? All right, I don't get this email out of the blue.
oh, no.
Is there some kind of training orientation? Do I get a foot massage with every visit from the connected network people? What happens here?
Well, so this is part of the reason that we are focused on existing networks right now, right? So climate and capital was the alpha experiment, right? That was the kind of initial test case. And that's a B2C model where you Spitz as a professional in climate and sustainability can join, and you pay your way and great. And in that case, what we've found is actually kind of interesting that people tend to come in through a referral, and or they see the steps on the site and it's super easy, and they're like, I think that'd be kind of fun to meet someone new every once in a while, and that's literally all it takes. And so they that's the B2C model. Part of the reason we're doing the B2B model for this for the cohort is because what we're trying to do is come with the existing set of shared purpose, right? That was why we started actually with climate and sustainability, is because in every conversation, you need something to fall back on. Spitz, you and I might have enough. What's that old line from Oscar Wilde's the Selfish Giant, that like he left his friend the Cornish ogre after 7 years because they'd run out of things to talk about and their conversation was limited. Like
Yeah.
there's we can talk for a little while, but there is you always want something to say, like, okay, I don't know what to say to you, but I can talk about climate, and you have something to say about climate, so we'll be good. If you have this shared purpose and center point for any network, that's good. That's a baseline. And so, go ahead.
So there's an implicit understanding that when I hit that link, match, okay, I feel like matching, that you're going to connect me with someone who's relevant, engaging, and beneficial to me.
Right. And so, that means different things to different organizations. So, for example, an alumni network of a school or a business, most of the time we join we go to a school, or we work for a business because we kind of want to be around the people who are also working there, right? Like we respect them. And so you already have this precursor to your motivation, that the person joined, right? They joined your business because they trusted the people around them in your business. So you have that it's not random. And so that is enough for a lot of people, for some portion of your population, of your network, to join. And that's enough to get over that hurdle. Okay.
Sounds good. So when I get that email, I have familiarity with what you're about.
Right.
I know what I'm potentially in for. And if I have the time and inclination, I know based on all that when I click that match link, that I'll be hooked up with someone else within my own organization who will, in some way, benefit me, my job, what I'm trying to do, either emotionally,
Right.
cognitively, in terms of my everyday tasks, and ideally all of above. Is that right? Okay.
So, okay. So you say, "Hey, yes, I'd like to participate in this match round. I've got time this next week." And so
I say that or I just click on the link?
no, so you say that, and the reason that's super important, that thing that you're touching on, that nuance, is it's important for the person to be empowered in their own right and control the matching. So it's not simply that you're connecting to a Calendly, right? It is that you want the person to say, "I want to meet someone at the following times," right? That's
See, that,
important.
that I think is an important point. Some would say that that would reduce engagement because it's adding a step.
Yep,
But it sounds to me like that confirms and enhances intentionality.
exactly.
Right.
So you then tell the system when you want to meet someone, and it goes away and it thinks about who it thinks you're going to have a great conversation with based on all those criteria and good things and our lessons and our matching stuff, insight.
It's a black box.
It
It
is
is the black
for the
box that
user, it's a
this
total
the
black.
simple input. I'm interested. I'm free Tuesday afternoon from 2 to 4.
Right. Now,
And
we add in one more question, which is interesting, which is what's the problem you're trying to solve for this week?
great. That's great. I love that specificity.
And
So that gives me assurance as a participant that we're not going to just bullshit for the next hour and that it'll be worth my while.
right. And the system is built in to challenge you, to constantly push you outside of your comfort zone. So sometimes it'll match based on that need, right? But sometimes it'll say, "You know what? The reason you're meeting with this person is because you're in the same city and you're working on similar things, or you know similar people, or and you've never met, or maybe it's that you guys, I don't know. Spitz, down the road, one of the things we're working on, we're expecting is that, Spitz has been publishing pieces on X, right? I'm sorry, I shouldn't say on X because that implies it was on the platform, but like Spitz has been publishing pieces on,
I've been throwing my shit on X too, so I guess yeah.
but he's been publishing on topic A for the last little bit. And Jane, you really care about topic A, so that's why the system's, introducing you. And and so, there are lots of reasons. It doesn't have to be just for the transaction, but it comes away and it says, you know, Spitz, you wanted to participate in the match round. Here's Jane. We've put a calendar invite on the calendars at the time you've both said you're free. And
How do we deal with hierarchy here? So going back to Edelman, remember Richard? Richard
yep,
Edelman would hang out. He had his own little
yep,
cubicle in the open floor,
yep,
right on the corporate floor. He'd just come in. You'd see him in the elevator. Say hi to Richard. What's to preclude me being at Edelman? Let's say they plug you in.
yep, yep.
I'm free Tuesday at 2. I want to chit chat with Dick. All
Well, so nothing would stop you from doing that, right?
right,
But
all
the
right,
system, but the system would have a set of criteria that it would use to say whether that's actually going to happen, right?
all right. And then what about my manager who would be triggered to hell? I used to work for the great Bruce Hayes, who was an Olympian
Yeah,
swimmer at Edelman.
I remember Bruce.
Awesome guy. So let's say I'm just using this as a fictional and humorous kind of example because I'm sure our listeners are wondering, and I use your system to get a half hour with Richard,
Yep.
and Bruce hears from Richard that Spitz
Hmm.
reached out for a combo. I mean, WTF? I mean, how do you handle this kind of potential crossover?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So I think there's a couple things to note there. One is that, as I said, you're not gonna get Richard just because you ask, right?
I'm out.
The system is more interested in challenging you than it is in kind of in giving you exactly what you already know you want, right? And that is the super important thing for people to take away from this. This is
Okay.
not a replacement. This is not simply speeding up the LinkedIn process of Spitz going to LinkedIn and saying, I'm working on this week. Here's 5 people I'm going to send a direct mail to, and then one of them is going to respond to me, and I'm going to try and convince them to talk to me, right?
Or even more relevantly, I'm in the throes of a complicated, entangled spaghetti bowl mess of a project. All
Right.
right. And there are multiple leads on this and multiple specialists. This is typical.
Yeah.
And I'm having an issue busting into, let's say, the user experience team because they're not listening to my digital strategy.
Right.
And then I get this email opportunity from you to match up. And then I'm like, I want to talk to the UX guy because he's getting on my nerves.
Right. So in that case, you should reach out to the UX guy, right?
All
This.
right, this is a very important distinction I think I'm making, and
Yeah.
I'm tacitly assuming our listeners might be thinking of the same thing. We're drawing a line between the functional needs of cross-disciplinary organizations to work together each and every day on complex projects
Yeah.
and this ancillary opportunity that you are offering to expand my horizons with
And,
colleagues
and strengthen your ties with responsibility.
ostensibly outside my immediate day-to-day interaction with other people in the organization. Is that
That's
right?
right. That's right. And interestingly,
Okay. That's
those,
I think an important distinction here because I immediately leaped to the opportunity to streamline my
yep.
day-to-day agony dealing with people who don't listen to me.
Right. So let me give you an
Okay.
example, a really practical example. So this
Yeah.
actually, this happens in climate and capital, which is a slightly different, network, obviously, because it's not all within one organization. But
Right.
we get people all the time who are like, hey, they respond to that question and they say, hey, I'm struggling with X. I want to talk to someone Y, and so, and we're at the point where we can, get people to interesting conversations. So, we had someone write in a little while ago. I remember one of the things that was, I'd love to talk to, I'm thinking about emerging metrics on forest health, you know, and we actually had people for them to talk about. That's great. But they weren't the people that they were thinking, and that's super important because, another example, we had someone at one company who was, kind of mid-level, had come into a new role and was the only person like that in the marketing group in that organization. And so they were like, oh my God, I'm in this organization that really doesn't think like me. And I'm struggling to articulate things that I need to get across to them and the work that I need, the value of the work I need to do. The system matched them with people who could challenge them to talk to people who were different than them. And that, this person said, was so valuable because it wasn't mentorship. It's not like they were building this.
Right. I think this is a key point. It's not mentorship, it's not immediate team collaboration on specific deliverables. It's really educating and empowering yourself on the vast experience prevalent throughout this organization. And it plugs you into insights and opportunities you might not have had before, and it just makes you more educated and more empowered and feel like you're really part of something and loved and respected by another colleague whom you otherwise never would have interacted with.
And again, I go
Right.
back to this point that the system puts you, Spitz, and Jane in your best lights. So,
Right.
and
This is
that
cool.
that actually,
I'm liking this. This is not I'm more clear on exactly what your value proposition is and really the rationale. But what about the modus operandi?
yeah,
How does this experience work
yeah.
when
So
I make that Tuesday at 2 p.m. I want my match. Match me up.
literally, so the system goes away and then it says Jane meets Spitz, right? And it puts the calendar invite on, and you literally just click on the link Tuesday at 2 p.m. And that is it. It
And
is
then wait, so it's a video conference?
It's a video conference, and
And do you mind asking what tech is
uh,
plugged in? What do you use?
so version 1.0. So Climate and Capital works on Google Meet, And there were a
Okay.
bunch of technical reasons for that choice that I won't bore you with. But
Yeah.
the version 2.0 that we're on right now is not going to be using Google Meet. But you click on it and you basically get a video platform that everybody knows already. Like this isn't some crazy new platform. It's a video conference, but all you're doing is clicking on a link. So at this point, and you have half hour of good conversation. And
Do
what
I give permission to record? How
Yeah,
does
good
that work?
question. So in the Climate and Capital version, we do not record anything. We stand totally clear of the conversation. That's totally up to you. Now we have the privilege of doing that with Climate and Capital because we're not actually, we're not an organization and this is them. But for the new version, yes, you will every conversation you will be able to you will have to give opt-in permission to use the insights and do the analysis on it. That's why when we were talking before, I gave those stats of like the assumptions around, only 50% of those conversations will give you permission to do that.
Do I get a report or metrics of my conversation as follow up? Me
Yeah.
personally.
So 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 let's just stop for a second and like recap what's happened here for the individual, because we've just spent a bunch of time talking about it. But from the individual's point of view, they got an email that they responded to and they clicked on a link that was on their calendar. They have literally spent less than a minute every 2 weeks interacting with our platform. That's pretty minimalist for me.
But by that you mean the initiation and the engagement. But they're spending more time,
Yeah,
and really where the rubber hits the road is in the
in the
video
conversation.
it's the video conference
Right.
in real time with a peer, with a colleague, ostensibly outside of their fragmented tribe within an organization to a specific end, which is specified by the interaction that started this. What do you want to talk about? I want to talk about this.
Yep.
You match. You're the matchmaker. You're the peer to peer, colleague to
Totally.
colleague matchmaker for these folks who are eager to participate, to break silos, engage with their peers, and share and learn and
Absolutely.
make connections. All right,
Absolutely.
that's the heart. That's the heart of what
Totally.
is going on
And
here.
again, like from our point of view, like what I want is for the human interaction to stand at the center of this, right? That half hour that we set up, it is not the setup that matters. It is the half hour of conversation and how good we can tee that up to be. And then it is the serendipity of the two people talking and exploring what is interesting about they're each doing. That's where the magic happens. And the stories coming out of this are awesome. And it is because of that skill building around over time, of that drip, drip, drip of practicing being curious and practicing probing and practicing pitching to someone who doesn't think like you. That is the power of this over time. So at that point, you're doing the half hour. What's interesting is that, we set it up as half hour because everybody has half an hour, like every 2 weeks you can work half an hour in if you want to. But what's interesting is that a lot of the conversations we get feedback on, they're going much longer than half an hour. We've had people reach out to me and say like, you had no way of knowing this, but when we started talking, we went for 2 hours, and like we
Right.
canceled the
No,
call.
that's awesome. That's
Totally.
awesome.
But it
Right.
is
And that's a conversation and a connection that otherwise never ever would have happened.
totally. So we've had people
Right.
start businesses together. We've had people, challenge each other and go back for more challenging. We've had people who've hired people. We've had people who found jobs. We've had people, like all this stuff. They're great stories, but it is all because we are letting them explore each other and the relationship there without us forcing it into a transaction.
If I would be an HR manager or even HR SVP executive, or I'd be an organization and development person, the head of, they have the CEO and the CCO and the CMO, and they've got the
CFO.
CP. the
CPO,
CPO, which is the chief people officer.
right?
That's a big one, right?
Yep.
I would love this. And I would go even further. I'm just kind of riffing on my internal corporate PR kind of manner because I've done some of this too. Is it would be so empowering to share some of these as testimonials and case studies internally because these corporations do all of this schmaltz, right? They've got the mission and values watermarked in the hallway. They've got the potted plant by the elevator.
Yep.
They have, Friday happy hour and Taco
Yep.
Tuesday. And they kind of bribe staff with, food and bullshit. And it's always meant to be this kind of, here's an opportunity to meet your peers. Here's an opportunity to network. But these conversations are ad hoc, forced because they're in a live social setting
Yep.
in groups, and there's very little to no opportunity to really go mano a mano and meet one to one internally. And again, if I would be a CPO or an HR director or an organizational development expert, imagine like the internal PR and promo that could be used with these testimonials, and then
Totally.
showing colleagues as collaborators, and then sharing
Totally.
examples of, I never knew Steve,
Totally.
in the tech group, and we were supposed to talk for 20 minutes and it was an hour and a half, and now we're buddies, and then we share insights, and
But
it's
even more than
awesome. this
buddies.
is this
But
is
even
really,
more
this
than buddies.
never happens
Right.
usually. This
But
is
even
great.
more than buddies. Like this
Yeah,
is where it's powerful, right? Like Steve
yeah,
and Jane may never have really had a reason to talk, right? So there's not a
right,
transactional reason for them to connect.
right.
But what's powerful about this is that more than just becoming buddies, Steve and Jane now know how to draw on their perspectives, right?
Yes.
So now when Steve is struggling with something that Jane is good at, Steve may call Jane. And that from an organization's
Yeah,
perspective,
it's not just the
awesome.
conversation, but what leads out of it.
Yeah.
So they have an ongoing relationship. And then, to your point, a resource, an internal resource. And this could even be empathetic and emotional, which is, hi, Jane, how you doing? I'm just giving you a call. I had a rough day. Jane's
Totally.
like, well, tell me about it, Steve. I've had a rough day too.
Yep. But so there are real benefits even from knowledge sharing. So like there's technical research on knowledge sharing that is relevant here, right? So knowledge sharing often doesn't fail. There's a couple different places that knowledge sharing can approaches can fail. One of them is the input mechanisms, right? And that's where we tend to focus everything. We want to get all these case studies down so that the next generation of workers can use the lessons that we've learned, right? And and so then we store it on the cloud somewhere and we have it well organized so that everybody can reference it, right? That's one set of work. Interestingly, a lot of knowledge sharing doesn't do much because it doesn't stay alive after it is codified. And so what this is doing is saying, Jane now knows that she can call Steve, and oh my God, that knowledge sharing is flowing more because Steve will talk about what he's done, right? That's the thing that knowledge sharing networks want to have happening is that Steve's talking more about what he's learned. That's the knowledge sharing. So there are really kind of technical reasons that this works well. But I want to go back to, so before we go on to the last step of the process in this, you touched on something about the individual's needs. So I want to kind of go back to the individual here and what they are getting addressed by this. One is the pain point of access and structural bias in how we network. Now, I should be clear, like connecting parts of a network that don't normally intersect, that can be a racial and diversity based discussion, right? But there are plenty of other types of non-diversity related structural bias in networking, right? It's basically just like who is actually capable of connecting with you, right? And I was just having a conversation the other day with this global organization that convenes members from around the world at these exceptional events that they put on and have enormous impact through the events. But the constraint is who shows up at the event, who is actually able to get on a plane to show up at that summit, right? And And so it's, what we're doing is slowly bridging parts of the network that would not normally ever interact and touch each other for a variety of structural bias reasons.
Yeah, I love this. And there's an ancillary halo effect. So, just like you've got nodes and links in a network, when you connect Steve with Jane, you automatically connect everyone they know. So, when Steve and Jane are connected and this conference is coming up, Jane is involved with, from an organizational, professional, logistical point of view, dozens, if not hundreds, of other staffers,
Right.
as is Steve.
Totally.
So it's not just this one to one connection that you're triggering and fostering and growing, but in a sense, the two nodes of the network have conjoined. And with them is an exponential increase in the connectivity throughout the organization.
Now you're totally on it. So, and we
That's the real economy of scale here.
right.
That's the exponential growth of networking engendered by ostensibly just a casual conversation on a Tuesday at 2 o'clock.
Right. Now,
Yeah.
there's a really interesting point to make here, which is that normally when organizations try to do this, what they are doing is they create a program that looks effectively like a V, right? So, I'm visualizing a V here, but the organization has the two ends of the V, right? The 2 points up at the top that are the stakeholders that it wants to connect, right? And both of those, in order to connect, they have to go through the organization. And so the organization sets up this team that will connect people within the stakeholder group, and it will manage the messaging and so on, and materials and the discussion that happens between the two, right? That's a win for the organization. That's awesome. Lots of organizations do that, and they do it well. They can be really strategic. The problem is that it's really hard to scale, right? And so what ends up happening is that as people get excited about being two of those people at the ends of the V, the team that is doing the connecting gradually gets overwhelmed. And it gradually, unless it is super strategic and really analytical, it just takes them as they come, and it's not actually feeding business objectives. It's just taking them as they come.
Yeah, it's completely ad hoc, really, and it's a wash in everything that's going on
Sure.
throughout the day.
Sure. So what is interesting that's starting to happen is that in those networks, you get the tops of the V connecting with each other without having to travel down through the bottom of the V. But the organization gets to define the pretext and the context for the conversation that those 2 points of the V have, right? So Jane and Spitz may be alums of the same school, right? And normally the school would invite them for a reunion where it controlled the entire experience, right? And that's where Jane and Spitz would meet. Now, what can happen is, what if Jane and Spitz and Jimmy and Jennifer all connected separately with each other and started to actually make their own connections and synaptic fires, right? And the thing that was connecting them was that they all knew that the school was setting up these conversations with other alums, and that they could feed things back to the school that the school would care about, and no matter what the alums worked on together, that's a good thing for the school, right?
Yeah,
That
you're adding intent, strategic intent to these interactions, which otherwise would be single point of control and ad hoc.
Well, and they might not ever happen, and that's what's
Right.
really
Or they won't happen usually.
right.
Right.
And so
Yeah.
but the really important thing here is that what it does is it frees up that bottom of the V resource, that school-based alumni advancement team, to be more strategic in who it's talking to, because it doesn't have to curate all of those buzzy little connections that are happening, right? All it needs to do is understand where the important ones are, and that's where it can focus its attention. That is scalable, and it is really strategic and valuable for the school. So
And has exponential impact to the point we were making earlier about the nodes and the links and the way
totally.
networks work. Yeah.
Totally. Okay, so
Yeah.
that's point number one of the individual need is like I have a problem because I want to go to this global summit with all these other incredible people who are members of this organization, and I can't get there. So I want access, and I want access to people that I wouldn't normally meet, even if I went to the subject summit. Okay, that's pain point number one. Pain point number two is the yuck of networking, right? For the individual. It's just like we talked about. Normally, networking is overwhelming. If you're introverted, it sucks. It requires proactive extroverted behaviors. All of this is just, often when you show up, there's a dynamic that's created because I've reached out to you on LinkedIn and I'm hoping you'll say yes, but you're looking at me as trying to sell you something. Like all of this dynamic shifts in these conversations. Suddenly it's peers and it is interesting. The third thing that is really important that we've touched on already is this emotional connection. At an individual level, we like to be seen, heard, and understood. And in general, we suck at listening. And so people often don't feel,
What? What was that last? Oh, I'm sorry.
but in general, like people don't feel
No,
seen or
this is
understood.
true. This is everyone's they don't listen because they can't wait to open their face.
Totally.
I'm guilty of this where, I'm can you hurry up and say what you're saying because I want to say something.
Absolutely. And that's you know uh, there are some really interesting stats about this. So there's one from the U.S. Surgeon General Vivek Murthy, who they published this report, and we overlaid two sets of data for how we pitch this when we talk to clients. And it's a wonderful way to start because it starts good conversations, but it is this felt sense of loneliness and lack of connection over the last 20 years, so since 2003, the first set of data we took was the rise in the number of large scale engagement and communication platforms. So in 2003, that was the beginning of like Facebook and LinkedIn and Twitter, now X. And then as you go along, it gets into Slack and TikTok and like all these communication channels that we have to engage and communicate. And yet, when you overlay the Surgeon General's data on social isolation for the last 20 years, it is shockingly correlated. And and so what we see is that even though we have these ways to interact with each other and engage each other, we are actually interacting less and
Well,
with
their
more.
excuse is not to interact directly. So, it's the Jonathan Haidt point of view that, our kids are being annihilated because they can't play with each other anymore.
But there's an interesting one of the points that Murthy makes is that over the last 20 years, we have actually increased objective measurements of how much time we spend alone by 8%. That is, that is significant. And what's interesting is that that decline in social connection is actually most prevalent for young people between 15 and 24, and then the next age bracket up. So we are, the reason we do this is because we start off by talking about just how real the data is behind your felt sense of lack of connection to the people and the work you are part of.
Yeah, and you're turning on its head because you're ostensibly using technology, digital technology, to enhance communication and not take it away. So a video conference isn't as intimate as,
Oh,
let's say, a coffee table conversation,
totally.
but it's leagues, if not infinitely apart, in the sense of no communication or no conversation. And I would tacitly assume, too, that if Steve and Jane have that great conversation on Tuesday afternoon, and then they get to know each other and share insights and empathy, that it might lead to hanging out in a coffee shop or going to that conference and genuine human interaction.
Yeah, I get a lot of emails from members who say, hey, I was traveling to X city and I reached out to the, two people that I'd met through Connect,
Right,
and
right.
we had a
That's great.
wonderful dinner. Like I
That's
get a lot of
great.
those.
Yeah.
So,
That's
okay,
great.
so let's go back to the last. So those are the kind of individual pain points, but let's go back to the last step because it's important. And that's that so from a user's point of view, that's all you have to do, right? That's it. You can just show up, have a good
Yeah,
conversation.
yeah. So again, just in summary, I got my email. I've got the opportunity to match. I, in writing, tell you guys, hey, I want to match. I tell you guys why I want to match. You guys match me based on my availability. I match in the form of a video conference or call with the person you match me with. We engage, we share insights and ideas and experiences and empathy in ways we otherwise likely never would have had.
Right.
And then,
And then there are three types of learning that happen. So, um,
cool.
the first type of learning is for the individual. So, and the system allows for journaling, for looking at for rating. We have we're building in a slightly more complicated rating than just thumbs up or thumbs down in order to be actually more useful for the system and the individual. Like, what are you learning from this conversation? But that's quick and you don't have to do it. But if you do and you decide you want to journal, like over time, what starts to happen is the system can actually give you insights for yourself, right? Hey, did you know that when we match you with someone who is outside your comfort zone in the following ways, you actually talk to them differently than you talk to people who are inside your comfort zone, who are like you? Did you know that when you start a conversation by asking how they are doing and what they're working on, that the conversation goes 15 minutes longer than if you start it with yourself? Those kinds of insights, may or may not be useful to the person, but if they want them, they're there to be had. And as I said, like what we see qualitatively is that the language that people use when they've done 20 matches is different than when they just start. And if you can get those played back to you, then the learning there and the reflection is something that most people don't ever get, and not certainly not on a consistent basis. The second type of learning that happens is for the organization. And that's aggregated to your point before and anonymized. But the point is that what you can say is like, hey, we are connecting parts of your organization or offices or stakeholder groups that don't normally talk to each other. And here's how they're finding it. Conversations between engineers and comms people turn out to go for, an extra 10 minutes on average. And they over index on length. Here's the types of feedback that people are giving on conversations with people who are of younger generations. All that kind of stuff. Here's what the dynamic of your activities in the network looks like. And then the third type of learning is for us, and that's just the system getting better and better at matching. And that's kind of the whole process. I mean, and again, all of this is happening in the back end, and yeah, it can get complicated, but from the user's point of view, it's so simple, and it's something we already know how to do, which is just talk to someone who's interesting, who's in front of us. One person. You don't have to be good in a group. You're already in your best light, and you're being set up by someone that already does all the work for you.
Yeah, I love this. And wearing my CPO hat, Chief People Officer, I would love a step four, which is the opportunity of the participants to share their experience back with me. I want to hear about how this went. I want to hear about the benefits to you. And I would love your permission to disseminate bits and pieces, even of your conversation or what you learned, at the very least, your feedback, so that I can engender greater participation and create this culture where we care. And the proof that we care is we're facilitating and encouraging exactly these kinds of interactions.
Okay.
Right on.
Process.
That's pretty good.
Yeah. And we're
That's pretty good.
it's the
So
users
so
make the
how's it going? You've been plugged in a couple years. You've ironed out some of the technical kinks and presumably some of the behavioral ones.
input.
And what kind of feedback have you got? What kind of aspirations do you have for scaling out?
Yeah. So
And what does awesome look like for the next 6 months, a
yeah.
year, 2 years ahead?
So the feedback's been good. I think like any early prototype, there was stuff that people wanted and didn't see, and there was stuff that didn't work and people want fixed. But there's also stuff that just shocked people. Like and it's the shocking stuff that's so interesting, that's so powerful about this and that I'm taking away. So that is, from a feedback point of view, all of the testing and kind of like product piece is expected. I think the human piece of it is what's so powerful and is what's making me excited about this next stage. Where we are right now is we're pulling together this group of 10 client cohorts who the 10 client cohort that can work with each other, not just in beta testing. I mean, like, yeah, they'll get their fingerprints all over what's effectively a bespoke product when we build this version 2.0, this expanded version. But they will be working with each other to collaborate on how they use human interaction at scale to impact business and social outcomes with leaders who are thinking about this in fascinating ways. Some of those conversations are everything from national youth development organizations through to professional associations, through to international chambers of commerce, through to education innovation groups, you name it. But the use cases are fascinating. And so this group is coming together, and we'll work with them, like we talked about, to build this expanded version 2.0. And that's really this next 6 months is how do we create this really powerful product, this iteration of this product that we've been testing for 2.5 years. We've got lots of good insight. And that's what's so much fun about this is just that
Yeah,
we're
that's terrific. Terrific. I'll
absolutely.
put links to reach you to check out your website. And if you've got some of these cases and examples, we could link them direct for people to check out the goodies that are already coming out of this great idea.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, and in ways we've come full circle. I opened this with the bad radiology predictions of two experts, the one on the side of the AI and technology, and the other on the side of the actual oncology expertise. And the implicit conclusion of their prediction that radiologists need to quit their jobs and we should unplug the entire specialty, the implicit conclusion is that you can't take the ghost out of the machine. You can't remove the man from behind the curtain. You can't take empathy and humanity out of empathetic and human communities who do stuff. Companies are people. You could plug in the most advanced artificial general intelligence, and it's not going to take over the world as long as we have a world to live in. It's lived human experience. It is a community of like minded souls with a shared goal, which isn't just about making money. It's not just about the usual key performance indicators of what we ascribe success to, but it's about human interactions and connections and feeling good about ourselves and enhancing our respective qualities of life. And this has absolutely zero to do with technology. So, even and especially when you ramp up the technological infrastructure, people benefit and people need to relate to other people doing people things. And I think your organization hits that home, which is despite and in spite and maybe to spite the ubiquity of this AI revolution, it's about the people. Duh. And if we can enhance our interrelatedness to each other, add transparency and immediacy to it, remove any kind of technological hurdles, make it as remedial and direct as possible to encourage its adoption, then people will get to know people better, feel good relating to each other, and then be able to live the lives worth living and the lives they love amid all this crazy technology. So the bottom line here is like Douglas Adams. Don't panic and embrace opportunities like, the connected network, Dave Garrison, to make your organization more human, more empathetic, and as a result, more efficient. You're going to have better sales. You're going to have a better network of like minded souls doing great stuff simply by encouraging and empowering people to talk to each other. Woohoo.
I like it.
All right. Well, thank you for listening to the Bald Ambition podcast, streaming wherever podcasts are streamed, which is probably self evident given the fact that you've been listening. Given that, though, like, comment, and share. And reach out to David, who will be happy to answer any and all of your questions about what he's doing, how he's doing it, and potentially plugging it into your organization.
Hey, thanks, Spitz, for having me on. For what it's worth, I'm really glad that, the work you're doing to spark these conversations is important. And I'm glad the world has you doing it.
I appreciate that. And it just reinforces your value proposition. Just two people talking to each other, sharing empathy. And my day is already better having reconnected with you. And I'd be love to catch up with you in 6 months or a year and see how things are going.
That'd be great. All right. We'll
Take
talk to
care,
you soon.
Dave. Yeah, bye bye.